Hello and welcome to Occupied Thoughts, a podcast brought to you by the Foundation for Middle East Peace. My name is Ahmed Moor. I'm a non-resident fellow at the Foundation. Today is February 13th, 2025, and I'm delighted to be here with Jay Ulfelder, who until recently was the program director at the Nonviolent Action Lab at Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center for Governance and Innovation. Jay, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's a huge pleasure. I mean, the reason I reached out obviously is I received this resignation letter. I'm on Sarah Roy's list. For the listeners who don't know, Sarah Roy is a researcher who works at Harvard, and she sends out emails mostly related to Palestine, Israel, but also U.S. politics. And so she shared your resignation letter, and it's really an astonishing document. And with your permission, I'd like to get into it later. But I think to start, it's worth just learning more about you as a scholar and a researcher. You've done some really important work on forecasting atrocity in the past, although that hasn't been your recent focus. Could you describe some of that work?
Yeah, I'll just give a little context to that too. I'm a political scientist by training, finished graduate school in the late 90s, spent after kind of bopping around for a bit. I spent about a decade as research director for what was called the Political Instability Task Force, which is a US government and specifically CIA funded research program that is basically a panel of scholars who were helping the government or policymakers um, anticipate and understand different kinds of political instability in countries around the world, um, including mass atrocities, or what in the PITF parlance was called genocide and politicide. Um, I did that for about a decade, left that and was freelancing for a while, mostly back with clients who people I'd gotten in touch with and worked with through the PITF stuff. So still more government contract stuff. That's where the money tends to be for for political scientists who aren't in academia. Um, and one of the clients, the main projects I did during that time was helping the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's Center for the Prevention of Genocide design and then start running a what we called an early warning system, basically a statistical forecasting model to anticipate onsets of state-led mass killings, sort of euphemistic version of talking about genocide um, in countries around the world. The goal there being the center's mission was to to help governments and non-governmental organizations, activists, et cetera, try to anticipate and prevent or mitigate these kinds of things from happening. Um, so I did that, then was in the private sector for a couple of years, unemployed for a bit, and then came to the Kennedy School in 2020, like late, whatever, summer of that year. Yeah.
So, in order to build a statistical model to think about forecasting,
Yeah.
you've got to have a definition, a working definition of
Yeah.
what it is that you're forecasting around or
Yeah.
forecasting, I guess. And so what is that definition? What is the working definition for the CIA working group?
Yeah. I'm going to have to try to dust off the
Been a
part
long
of my
time.
brain, remember the specifics. Yeah, because it's one of these things. I mean, this is part of what's telling, intriguing, et cetera, about all that work is, I mean, the subtext is partly the story that there are so many different labels and variations of definitions, in part because the politics of referring to something as genocide are so fraught, that, a lot of this was organizations trying to do something that was more or less about genocide, or just large numbers. The common thread in all of these definitions was large numbers of non-combatant civilians essentially being deliberately killed by some organization. Usually the focus was on when governments were doing it. So, state militaries, police, et cetera. So that's kind of the common thread through all those different projects, the PITF one, um, the work for the Holocaust Memorial Museum, Obviously, a lot of overlap with the UN's convention definition on that. But yeah, a lot of it was kind of, okay, we want to be anticipating what people might call genocide, but we don't want to get in trouble by slapping the genocide label on it and then having, like if the Holocaust Museum says this is a genocide, that in itself becomes a very fraught political statement, even if it's just some scholars kind of hashing out, yeah, we're looking at these criteria. This is sort of the checklist, and it seems to meet that. And there was a similar thing with PITF. It kind of broadened into yeah, a similar kind of deal of like the CIA didn't want to have some news story about, something gets called genocide necessarily. There was a whole name change. It had actually been called the State Failure Task Force originally, and it changed its name because there were news stories about the CIA labels X a failed state, and that became a whole political rigmarole of its own. So yeah, a lot of the stuff around these definitions was reflecting similar aspects of the kind of inevitable intertwining of actual politics and efforts to apply scholarship and analysis to understand these things. But yeah, the commonality in all that was just lots of non-combatant civilians being deliberately often was meant to, there might be some language in there to reflect that this could mean deliberate by neglect as well as actually shooting at or bombing somebody or that kind of thing. So induced famine, for example, could be construed as a form of mass killing slash genocide slash mass atrocities. If the folks inducing that famine could reasonably be expected to, or there was evidence that they understood that what they were doing was going to cause lots of people to die.
Understood.
Mhm.
And so just getting into some nuts and bolts a little bit. And again, I'll say for the third time, I know it was a long time ago, and so no worries if you don't want to or can't, but how do these forecast models work? I mean, I've seen that
Yeah,
you've published in the New York Times, you've
yeah,
published, I believe, 538. People think about political forecasting and polling.
yeah,
How do you translate, or how does that work? How do those models work in this context?
yeah. Um, you're essentially taking existing data on aspects usually of countries. So the unit of analysis or forecasting here was typically a country, um, and using statistical modeling to build a profile algorithm, whatever, that helps you see what are the attributes, the commonalities across countries where these things occurred in the past that can we can have some reasonable expectation would be potentially predictive in the future. And a lot of the work involved it's kind of a that work, and this goes for all that kind of forecasting works, it's at this funny intersection of theory and convenience or opportunity. Like we might have lots of ideas about from case studies, reading history, observing things in real time about what we think we see in the run up to these events, what kinds of countries they tend to happen in. In an ideal world, we would have structured data sets for all those features of interest for all the countries of the world for some like really long period of time, because to build a statistical model, you're typically training it on instances from the past, and the longer history you have, the richer sample you have, usually but not always, the better model you're going to get out the other end. Um, the convenience part is just that there are tons of things that we would love to know or be able to measure for models like that we just don't have data on, or we have data for some countries, but the existence of the data tends to be correlated, sometimes inversely, sometimes otherwise, with the features that are of interest. So, wealthy countries tend to have much better statistical bureaucracies that can generate all sorts of data on economic performance and censuses and populations and that kind of thing. Um, any then there's sometimes there's things like that, like there just aren't bureaucracies to measure things. Sometimes it's things like it would be lovely to know, but there are reasons why we don't know. For example, like how loyal is the military to the sitting chief executive, or how salient or sharp are splits across ethnic or communal groups within the military and the bureaucracy within the state. And those are hard things to see, and there are reasons why states might want to prevent us from seeing them. So yeah, there are a lot of things with models like that you'd like to be able to include in the model and can't, just because you don't have the data. So you end up sort of settling for, here's a long list of ideas I have about what might be usefully predictive. Here are the things I can actually measure off that list. Now let's, for some large set of countries over some long period of time, now let's train a model on that, see how that, model performs by some forecasting metrics, and then, apply that to cases going forward. So like as this year's data updates, and often you're training it like, well, how did things look like a year or two before the onset of the event? Because data in real time only become available on these things, like you don't get the 2024 economic statistics until sometime in 2025. So if you want to forecast, the onset of something based on recent stuff, you got to do all these funny lags. And anyway, this is starting to get a little technical, but I hope that gives a feel for how you go about doing that sort of thing. Yeah.
It does. And so then the follow-up convers or question is, how robust are these models? And embedded within that
Yeah.
is a question, how frequently do genocides or genocide type events, mass killings of civilians, occur?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think most people would be surprised, maybe fewer people who are or would be listening to this, and but I think a lot of people would be surprised that there tend to be like a handful of new ones of these every year around the world. Like um, that was there were more earlier in the 20th century, like early in the 21st century, there were um, substantially fewer, and I think we've gotten back to where we're seeing them more frequently again. That's still a very rare event, which does make it harder to do a good job forecasting. And even the best, like with all the stuff the PITF worked on, with the work I did at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, like this is not like weather forecasting. You're never getting to a model where you're like, yeah, I can confidently tell you this thing is pretty likely to happen in this place in this time frame. It's just nowhere close to that. It's much more like kind of triaging your attention. So there's going to be some set of cases with a lot of these things where they're the obvious ones, like let's say you're trying to forecast military coups, and there's some countries that have just tended to have these repeatedly in recent history. Like you don't need a model really to say, okay, they're probably at relatively high risk of these things happening again, even if the absolute probability in any given year is pretty low. So I don't really need a model to do that part. What you're typically looking for more in the results of these models are the surprises, either the cases that um, tend to have, again, relatively high risk, like given that these are rare events, we're often talking about, the probabilities of models spitting out might be like 5%, 10% chance in a given year of something happening. But for most cases, it's approximately zero. So that's still like, okay, if I'm going to put my attention somewhere, I'm going to put it on this case with the like 5% risk. So you're looking for the ones that are surprises, like who's close to the top of that list that you weren't expecting, um, or who did you think was close to the top of the list, but the model's suggesting isn't, and what's going on there. So it's often kind of a way to guide whether it was policymakers or NGOs with the, Holocaust Museum work, kind of help them direct their attention, which is limited, to some small number of cases that the model's suggesting they might want to give more attention to than they have been already. But with zero, like, yeah, you're not even close to like an accuracy rate in the of 2/3, 3/4, like, yeah, of the cases that had an onset, you're hoping that, maybe 3 of every 4 are in what you said was like the top 20 riskiest cases. Like that's about as good as it gets. Um,
Last question on the modeling, but are there attributes or things that when they flashed, you go, wow, this is really predictive? Are there attributes that you can share for a society that may be predictive of mass atrocity?
yeah, and well, again, yeah, and I'm going to have to scrape my brain to try to remember what was in the last rounds of work we did on that. Um, and again, the focus was pretty consistently on state-led mass atrocities here. So we're usually talking about governments, um, doing awful things to people who live in their borders. Um, these tended to be things that, not terribly surprisingly, authoritarian governments did. It tended to happen in societies that were already um, featured, um, sharp communal, ethnic, whatever, however you want to put it, sort of not necessarily segregation, but tension, stratification, polarization of some kind. Um, Mass atrocities also are substantially more likely to happen in the context of armed conflict. So often, governments essentially responding to some militant threat with, you know, massive, disproportionate, and indiscriminate force against populations that they think might be sympathetic to or harboring or whatever it is. Um, this armed threat of some sort. Um, Having had coups in the recent past was something that I think I'm remembering correctly, tended to be predictive of these. But yeah, I'd have to actually look back at, at the paper. It's been like, I think the last round of analysis I did on this was probably, yeah, 10 to 12 years ago. Um, and I don't know, I have not kept close track of the research on that since then. I don't know how much people have been publishing that kind of work.
Well, I mean, just as you're speaking, I'm obviously thinking about the genocide which is underway in Palestine, and
Yeah.
I'm not a scholar. I think about the ethnic cleansing and what's occurred there in kind of a continuous state,
Yeah.
and with spikes of activity and shocking violence. So you've transitioned from kind of a work focus to thinking about the domestic U.S. context.
Yeah.
And that's the work that you were doing at Harvard when you resigned over the genocide. Can you just reflect on that a little bit? And I don't know if you saw this Foreign Affairs article describing, the new authoritarianism in the United States.
Yeah.
If you haven't, we don't have to go there.
Yeah, no, I did read that. Yeah. The Steve Levitsky and Luke and Wei thing. Yeah.
So yeah, eager to hear how you transitioned into the Kennedy School and the focus of your activity there.
Yeah. Um, the, I mean, it was serendipitous for me that I got work there actually. So I was hired to work at the Kennedy School at the lab specifically by Erica Chenoweth, who's on the faculty at Harvard and leads the Nonviolent Action Lab. We knew each other from political instability task force days. They'd done some work with the task force, um, and had remained, friendly colleagues from then, overlapped in various ways. And I posted something on Instagram about being unemployed. And Erica saw it and said, "Oh, we need I'm starting this lab and we need somebody to work here," and asked me to apply for that. And so anyway, that's how I wound up with the work. And a lot, part of what I was doing was just supporting Erica and their work in general. But one of the lab's core projects is this crowd counting consortium, which Erica and Jeremy Pressman, who's a political scientist at University of Connecticut, co-started in 2017 around the Women's March. And this was an effort to um, evolved into an effort to track U.S. protest activity across all sorts of events or themes, issues, whatever, basically making an event data set for scholars to use um, in studying social movements and protest activity, for activists to use, both to kind of see what else is going on in the world, however else it might prove useful to them, and journalists, the same thing, kind of tracking trends in U.S. protest activity. So that's where the greatest need seemed to be with the lab once I started working there, and that evolved into absorbing most of my work time and most of my day, almost every day, for over 4 years. Um, in part because we were able to go from the project had started with a focus on tracking these events through the news media using a web crawler that looks at news websites, and with me dedicated pretty much full time to it, we were able to do a lot more with social media. And so that's a lot of what I was doing, was watching social media, both sort of independent journalists, activist accounts, media accounts, whatever, whoever else was talking about, reporting on, describing protest activity, and making this event data out of it. Um, which, yeah, it kind of became an all-absorbing thing. And I think I alluded to this in the brief email exchange we had earlier today. It also really pushed my politics further left, and I mean, for lack of a better way to put it, this this kind of act of or process of witnessing protest activity on a daily basis, watching, clips of like grieving parents at vigils for their kid who'd been shot and killed by a police officer, or um, you know, uh, Palestinian and other Muslim American and other folks showing up to, a rally to oppose the genocide in Gaza, and it's mothers and kids and grandparents and friends and whatever, and some, guy rolls up in a car and waves a gun at them, and it's a part. So it was two things. It was both hearing all of these things that, people making very compelling points about a lot of things that you don't see a lot about in the media, um, and seeing a very kind of different side of American politics, society, culture, et cetera, than you typically get that way. But also the contrast itself, the contrast between what I would see there and then how I would see commercial media talk about the same events, which really drove home for me. I mean, I knew this intellectually. It's stuff I'd paid attention to before, thought about, but seeing firsthand, like the manufacture of consent, however you want to put it, the way a version of a narrative about what's happening in the country gets constructed and reconstructed and pushes out other voices, other narratives, um, and how like constant that is and heavy it is. And yeah, that really that also, if I went from somebody who was willing in late 2001, in part because at that time it was, like, oh, what's a good thing you can do for society? Well, you can help the US government worry about threats from abroad. If I went from somebody who saw the world that way in 2001 to somebody who, by 2024 was thinking, man, you know, this idea that there are all these threats from abroad and what it is my government is doing and whose name and who it's doing it to, both in the US and everywhere else, um, really angers and disgusts and frustrates me. And I see all these people trying so hard to do something to change it, and they're silenced or ignored or repressed. Uh, you know, um, yeah, that really has me seeing the world very differently than I did 20 years ago.
I mean, it's an extraordinary story. And, being a Palestinian American, somebody who was born in Palestine and kind of grew up around the world in countries that Trump described once as shithole countries,
Yeah,
Palestine, Haiti, Sudan, Sierra Leone.
yeah,
Always had this, ambivalent relationship to the United States, and particular relationship to U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
Um, but um, but I wonder if what you're describing kind of underpins the overall effort to gut the academy. I wonder if your reaction is in microcosm what people and our kind of elite politicians and others are perceiving on a broader basis.
Yeah.
I mean, will you reflect on that for a moment? And then I'd love to read from your extraordinary letter, your resignation letter, if you're open to it.
Yeah, yeah. If you think that's constructive, absolutely. I think yeah, the letter itself focused um particularly on the repression of activism around the genocide in Palestine, um uh and that's, I think, absolutely where the focus of my frustration has been. I guess there is a subtext to it that is concern about that was rising concern, frustration with the way that the academy in general and really powerful institutions like Harvard in particular normalize a lot of the things I was talking about, like the role they play in constructing and reconstructing those narratives that I was talking about a minute ago. Um, and I think that's typically a much subtler process, and it doesn't take a conspiracy or people meeting in a room and saying we're going to do this. These are all sort of disconnected but parallel or reinforcing processes happening all the time. But um, I think I was acutely concerned with uh, after everything that's happened, the really intense repression of activism around the genocide in Palestine and calls for Palestinian liberation in the last 16 months, that we were at this kind of fork in the road with the Trump administration coming in, where it's like, yeah, this is like the larger expression of a similar process, and these institutions are at a place where they can choose between recognizing that and trying to save whatever shred of those supposed ideals of academic freedom and discourse and so on might be left, or choose to kind of succumb and play along and cooperate and
But they are, and they're still being
yes,
gutted. And so,
yeah,
well, what are we missing here? They've rolled over. They're doing what's required. The
yeah,
IHRA, which we'll hopefully get to, they're doing all of that stuff, and
yeah.
yet they're still being attacked. So what do we?
Yeah, which is what blows my mind. Like, that's or it shouldn't. I mean, again, this isn't surprising because these stories are as constant and as old as human politics. But um, and I guess part of it is, yeah, that this larger neoliberal creep in everything. And so, of course, the people who comprise the Harvard Corporation and the people they appoint and the donors who support, um, who have the most to give and care the most about reshaping these things are all kind of thinking in the same direction. It's a very uh, kind of brand focused, um, and just inherently conservative mindset. And yeah, I think that's kind of where we are. In some ways, that's I mean, I have traveled some internationally. My earlier career stuff was focused on studying the Soviet Union before it collapsed, and then parts of it afterwards. And um, so some comparative perspective on this, but yeah, like the US is just a pretty conservative place on a lot of these things. And I think to an extent we don't realize. So gutting, I mean, was it, I don't know how, I'm sure you and any other Palestinian American or someone who's tried to study or push these issues in the academy before, has been living this for decades. Ditto for scholars of racial, apartheid, segregation, et cetera, in the United States, like that, these things. It's like it's just, I think it's getting laid bare in some ways. It's not that it's necessarily new, but it's just getting laid bare. There's sort of this forcing function of of the genocide and of the Trump administration and so on, that's kind of forcing the hand of people to show that this is what they were doing and thinking more openly, rather than it being some like big shift in what they were doing or thinking.
So now I'm going to read from the letter because it is really an extraordinary document and an extremely ethically oriented statement. In protest of the university's response to the ongoing genocide in Gaza and deepening repression of student activism opposing it, I've decided to quit my role as program director of the Nonviolent Action Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm a political scientist by training, with professional expertise and decades of experience on ethno-nationalism, social movements, democratization, and genocide. I know that Zionism is an ethno-nationalist project, and that ethno-nationalist projects inevitably involve racism and authoritarian governance and violent boundary maintenance. I know that Israel's brutal campaign in Gaza over the past 16 months is a genocide, punctuating a 76-year history of violent dispossession and subordination of the Palestinian people. These are all things I know, and yet I now risk running afoul of the university's anti-discrimination policies and harming the work of the lab and the Ash Center if I say them in public. I mean, that's powerful stuff. We've just spent half an hour talking about your qualifications and your experience and your methodological approach to thinking about these topics. And suddenly the IHRA definition is foisted upon you. This is
Yeah.
separate from the structural reality of operating or working at a place like Harvard. So what
Yeah.
is the IHRA definition about? What does it mean?
I mean, yeah, and I don't want to like parse it in any particular way, but I mean, the simplest version of it for me is the key part of it in my mind is the conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and the conflation of accusations of genocide with anti-Semitism. This idea that you can't that Israel is so essential to Jewish identity that folks who would have issue with Israel are inherently taking issue with Jews and Judaism, and that essentially puts the burden back on the critics of like, okay, you're being anti-Semitic, you need to explain how you're not, or that and that it just it's so ridiculous on its face. I mean, again, part of what I was have I mean, so two things come to mind. This is a little disorganized, but okay. So one is, you know, I criticize my own government all the time. I criticize American policies in all sorts of ways. Um, that's not a protected class. I should be able to do that of the policy of any government, of any state. That's just the nature of politics and political discourse. Like to have any thing that's suggesting that critiquing like the military campaigns called by governments and is somehow prejudicial towards some class of cultural class of people. Just it seems so ridiculous. And again, I know there's a lot more in the IHRA definition. The point here wasn't, are there some good parts of it? Are there some bad parts of it? It was if these key parts of it imply that somebody at Harvard who is Jewish can lodge a complaint against somebody for saying Israel is committing genocide in Gaza, and that complaint can then have professional repercussions for you individually. It can damage, as I was alluding to there, and I want to be clear, neither the lab nor the Ash Center were part of the problem for me. They were, I thought, places that were not um, imposing these kinds of restrictions, and I won't speak for them, but my senses are, um, would not welcome those kinds of restrictions in a general sense. Um, that if it creates these opportunities for people from inside and outside the university to just bury you under um, you know, defamations of character, attacks on your, get you bogged down, spending all your time responding to oh, these people are anti-Semitic, and um, uh, rather than being able to just continue doing the work you're doing, and speaking freely about matters that you have expertise on. I know that's a little disorganized, and but
No, it's
really,
very clear. It makes
yeah,
perfect sense. I mean, in a way, again, I go back to that foreign affairs essay, which I hope we'll link to when
yeah,
we publish this podcast or this video. But it goes back to the ways in which kind of modern authoritarian or competitive authoritarianism, I think is the term used,
yeah,
works. And a big part of it is through, the suppression of dissent,
yeah,
dissenting voices, by levying all of these outsized
yeah.
taxes effectively on your time and resources.
Right, exactly. Just
Lawsuits,
get you stuck bogged down fighting these rearguard battles over things that seem that are not the point of your work, but become absorb your time and energy, and whether it's a state or another organization that has resources and time and people to throw at you. Yeah, that ability to get you stuck playing their game on their rules, rather than doing the work that you think is valuable is what was a major concern for me.
I don't want to spend much time on Harvard itself as an institution, but it occupies this, rightly or wrongly, it occupies this place in the American popular imagination. The Clueless movie was at Harvard, that kind of
Right.
thing. Uh, Brett McGurk is there now. I have my own experience. I did a 2-year degree, a master's degree at the Kennedy School.
Yeah.
It was bewildering. You'd walk around and see people who I believe were culpable, responsible for war crimes in
Yeah.
Iraq,
Yeah.
and they were in the building, and you don't know how to behave. You don't know how
Yeah.
to react. Brett McGurk is there now. He's at the Balfour Center. And for people who may be listening and don't know, but Brett McGurk is one of the architects of the genocide policy in the Biden administration.
Yeah.
Um, how do you think about that as somebody whose work is so heavily focused on human rights in subtext, if not explicitly? Uh,
Yeah.
what does that mean professionally? What does Harvard mean institutionally when people like that can go there?
Yeah. That was because I think I alluded to earlier, in a way, that's like the subtext of that letter is it's huge. The normalization of uh of both the violence itself and then the repression of dissent against the violence, and the normalization of like a huge concern for me going forward was the normalization of fascism in the United States. Like, and we already saw this. There was a good uh, letter to the editor, or op-ed, the other day in the Harvard Crimson by a couple of graduate students at the Kennedy School who were quite angry, and rightfully so. And this was exactly the kind of thing I was like, this is what's going to happen. In my head, I was thinking about, somebody who's a positive advocate for DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, at the moment, was invited by the Institute of Politics to come give a talk about government efficiency, and the focus of the talk was on how can we make government more efficient, and is DOGE doing this? And there was according to their recounting of the event, there was very little, there was no questioning at the event of like, wait a minute, who are these people and what are they doing and what do they stand for? And it's that kind of that normalization, like what are the questions that aren't being asked and what isn't getting talked about, and who is getting platformed, and who isn't getting platformed. Like, it's the if the this I feel like there's often, yeah, and again, we don't need to focus this on Harvard in particular, because in some ways that's the wrong focus. It's so much broader than that. We want to be close to power and money, and we want to, we also want to have, some give some presentation of discourse and dialogue, but only up to a safe point. And then it's like we need to be bipartisan and civil and all this stuff. And that is a huge part of the process of that sort of manufacture of consent. The media are playing and all these things. And if people aren't, they're not even aware that this is an issue, or if they are, it's like, wait a minute, am I crazy? Like, here's this person and they're getting invited to give this talk at this prestigious place. Like, I must be a bad person if I think that's wrong. Um, and I say all that, and part of this process for me too is, a recognition of my own role, culpability, whatever you want to call it. I mean, here I am, somebody who spent a good chunk of my career, on the payroll of the U.S. government, and specifically the U.S. intelligence community, et cetera. And so, yeah, maybe that's another subtext to the to the letter is, at some point recognizing that there's a um, I have personal responsibility for that too, and I need to own up to that and deal with that in whatever small ways I can. I'm not trying to center myself as the story here, but just, that's
No,
part of
I
my
think it's
identity.
an important point. I mean, again, I think in microcosm you represent, it's the TikTok ban. You kind of peered a little too closely at,
Yeah.
and you fell through the looking glass in a way,
Yeah.
um, so I want to ask you, you've taken an enormous risk. You've put yourself out there, being a staff member, at at a large university which has resources. That's not nothing. That's hard to do. And you've decided you don't want to be complicit, and you're giving that up. And so, um, why didn't you decide I want to work from within? I want
Yeah.
to change things from within. Because
Yeah.
the argument one hears about everything.
Yeah, for sure. And um, I think I there are a couple parts to that. For me, I mean, we mentioned, I think before we started talking on the recorded version of this, I actually work remotely, um, and so I'm not in the Boston area, and that leaves me a bit more disconnected from the university than obviously most staff are. In some ways, that meant I'm less, lots of aspects of what's going on there that I'm less familiar with. It also means I think it's harder for somebody in that situation to work from within. Like, I'm not having these daily conversations, with people at the office, that are not part of some formal meeting or whatever, where you might be more and have, lots of relationships outside of the ones I specifically had for work. I think people who are in that kind of position are probably much better situated to be effective at potentially working from within. And I mentioned in the letter, it's not that my decision to leave is, in my mind, the only right decision, the only ethical decision. It was, for me, one of a number of options, and I wasn't 100% sure it's the right option. I still am not. I never will be. It felt like the right thing for me, in part because of that degree of disconnect. Also, the fact that it seemed like, if I'm thinking, what else could I do with my time and energy, and given, the larger changes, political changes happening in the US right now, maybe focusing my energy on trying to mitigate damage within Harvard isn't the right place. Like, they're bigger fish to fry. Like, that's not for me again. And all of that's only possible because I'm late in, I'm in my mid 50s. I'm later in my career. I'm in a financial place where I can afford to be unemployed for a while. Like, and those are big and real privileges that a lot of people working in places like that don't have. So part of it's opportunity then, and part of it's also responsibility. Like, if not everybody can do this version of trying to draw attention to these issues, but if I'm somebody who can afford to do that, has the opportunity to do that, then maybe I'm the right guy to do that version of it, while lots of other good, extremely ethical, thoughtful people are busy trying to do the version of change from within.
I mean, that's a wonderful note to end on. I mean, there are ethical, hardworking people everywhere, and your letter, I think, resonates in lots of ways. And I'm hoping that lots of people who read it will internalize what it means, why you chose to resign, and seek to carve their own path in resisting what's happening domestically, but also what it means in Palestine, Israel, the ongoing
Yeah.
genocide.
Yeah.
Thank you so much to Jay Ulfelder.
Thank
Um,
you, Ahmed.
Thanks to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Occupied Thoughts. Please make sure to check out the FMEP website, fmep.org, for resources related to this podcast. And I'll try to make sure we get that foreign affairs article up. And if Jay's okay with it, we'll share his letter as well.
Yeah, of course.
And we look forward to the next episode of the podcast. Thank you again, Jay.
Thank you.